Hi, welcome. This is a tour of the carnivorous plants of Florida. My name is Lilly Anderson-Messec. I'm the director of North Florida programs for the Florida Native Plant Society. And carnivorous plants are one of my specialties and my areas of expertise and interest. And I love talking about them. They're so varied, and we live in the place to live. We are in the place to live if you like carnivorous plants. So what are carnivorous plants? Here is a photo of rhododendron viscosum that I took on a little creek in the western panhandle, commonly known as swamp azalea. And as you can see, it has little hairs that have little glands on the exterior of the flower. And you can see here, there are some little insects that are caught and have died on the exterior of that flower. And those dying insects will be able to be used and absorbed, eaten by the plant. But is an azalea carnivorous? No. The answer is no. We don't consider it carnivorous because it is not dependent upon carnivory in order to survive. It is using carnivory as a defensive mechanism to prevent herbivory. So this plant plants evolve through selective pressures, and one selective pressure is herbivory, so other animals eating these plants. And this plant has been selectively selected over time to have these sticky glands on the exterior, because the plants that had stickier glands on the exterior were able to reproduce because they weren't getting eaten by whatever insects were eating them. And so it evolved this mechanism, and that is how carnivory actually begins to evolve. Most likely it begins as a defensive mechanism in many cases, and then evolves into a dependency where the plant is actually dependent completely upon insects or invertebrates in order to survive. And so carnivorous plants are what we consider carnivorous plants are plants that are actively resourcing nutrients in insects and other animals because they are occurring in habitats that are nutrient poor. And typically they are nutrient poor due to low pH. The pH level, the soil is too acidic, and there might be nutrients in the soil, but because of that high pH level, the roots of plants are not capable of accessing nutrients. And so we have a lot of soils that are both anaerobic, don't have adequate oxygen in them, and are also high pH, and therefore the plants are unable to access nutrients in them. So most plants source all of the nutrients they need from photosynthesis and water, and importantly from soil. The majority of what these plants are getting from invertebrates are what the nutrients that plants typically get from soil. But again, these plants are growing in soil that are depleted of nutrients or have nutrients that are not available and accessible to the plants. And so rather than selectively beginning to compete better and harder and grow differently in the areas where there are plentiful nutrients, they have found this niche where there is low competition and low nutrients, and they've figured out another way to access nutrients that other plants haven't. So carnivory is an example of convergent evolution. There are many different plants across the world that are unrelated. You know, all plants are related essentially, but they're not closely related, but they look very similar because they have developed similar mechanisms for carnivory. Here is a Nepenthes pitcher plant, also known as pitcher plant, but it is not related to our pitcher plants here in North America. This only occurs in Southeast Asia, this species, but they look really similar because they have a similar mechanism that is successful for carnivory. So convergent evolution is the process whereby distantly related organisms independently evolve due to selective pressures, and they evolve these similar traits to adapt to similar necessities and environmental pressures. So they're adapting similar carnivorous forms because they are adapting to the same environmental pressures, which are lack of nutrients, and figuring out a way to eat other living organisms in order to access the nutrients. So successful forms succeed is a way to talk about convergent evolution. Many similar mechanisms and forms have evolved to access nutrient-rich animals in areas with poor nutrient habitats. And here is also a good example of the different types of traps. There are active traps, like the Venus flytrap that actively shuts closed. There are active traps like the bladderworts, Utricularia, that suck in insects and close. And then there are passive traps, like the pitfall traps of pitcher plants and the Nepenthes and Sarracenia. And then there are sticky traps, like that rhododendron, which is not technically carnivorous, but like the sundews that we have. So here we are in the Florida Panhandle, a hotspot for carnivorous plant diversity. It is such a gift to be here in this spot in the world. We are so lucky to get to have access to the intact Apalachicola National Forest, and in the Western Panhandle, we have the Blackwater River State Forest. These areas are unique and irreplaceable, and if you like carnivorous plants, people come from all over the world to see these places. There is nowhere else on Earth like them. There are 3 families in North America which contain carnivorous plants. That's the Lentoburlariaceae family, the Sarraceniaceae family, and the Drosseraceae family. And importantly, in the Sarraceniaceae family, there are only 3 genera within that family. There are Darlingtonia, which only occur, 1 species that only occur in California. There are Heliumphoras, which only occur in the Guana highlands in South America. And then there's Sarracenia, which only occur on the Gulf coastal plains in North America, nowhere else in the world. And there are about 11 species of Sarracenia, depending on which taxonomist you're talking to. And we have 7 of those species, 7 of the 11 species that occur in the world of Sarracenia. We have 7 of them in the Panhandle here. So not only are we rich in carnivorous plant species, but we're rich in biodiversity in general, in both flora and fauna. This area is especially unique, but of course this is a density gradient map, and you can see that we are especially unique when it comes to carnivorous plants. So here are the 3 families of carnivorous plants that occur in Florida. The Lentoburlariaceae family includes the Utricularias, which are commonly known as bladderworts, and we have 15 species of Utricularia in Florida. And it also contains Pinguicula, which are commonly known as the butterworts. We have 6 species of Pinguicula. And in Sarraceniaceae, we have the Sarracenias, the pitcher plants. We have 7 species. And then in the Drosseraceae family, we have Drosseras. We have 7 species of sundew, 5 species of sundew, which are Drossera. And then we also have Dionea, which is the Venus flytrap in Florida. It is not native, but it is native to just a little bit north of here, the Carolinas. And we'll talk about that later, but it's a monotypic genus. So there's only 1 species of Dionea within the genus Dionea, and it occurs here. So we're going to begin our tour now of all the native plants, all the carnivorous plants. These are the bladderworts, Utricularia, again in Lentoburlariaceae family. They are the most diverse carnivorous plant that we have in Florida, with 15 species. They're generally aquatic, so most of them occur floating in water, but some of them also occur in really wet soils. And so their traps are typically floating in water, or they're kind of suspended in consistently wet soils. Most of them look pretty much exactly the same. I mean, to a regular person, they look almost exactly the same. To a botanist, they look different, obviously. But almost all of them have yellow flowers, but we have 2 species that have those kind of pinkish purpley flowers. And here is a zoomed in illustration of what their traps look like, their bladder traps. And here's an actual photo of the traps here. And this trap mechanism is arguably the fastest mechanism in the plant world. It gets triggered and sucks in its prey in 1/100th of a second. So it's extremely fast. And the way it does that is it has these little tentacles on the edge of the opening of the trap. The trap is vacuum sealed closed with a little trap door. And the tentacles have exude a sweet secretion that attract little invertebrates in the water, aquatic invertebrates. And as they come munching on that secreted nectar on the tentacles get triggered, the door opens, sucks in all the water nearby, including the invertebrate, and then closes. And then once it closes, it secretes enzymes and acids to digest that invertebrate. Interestingly, recently I found out that this plant also it's omnivorous, not just carnivorous, because it can also eat and digest algae through these traps as well, which is really fascinating because a few species of them I've seen most often with black bladder traps, and they've all been triggered and have algae inside, and that's why they look black. Oh, here's a video I took of one, which is just a little demonstration of the architecture of this one species of Utricularia, which this is Utricularia inflata, and it creates this little pinwheel which it uses to hold up its bloom, its flowering plant part above the water. But underneath that little pinwheel is this long tendril with hundreds of, probably thousands and thousands of traps. And those tendrils can go for many, many feet. And when you break off, you can see actually the black bladders that are filled with algae on this individual. And if you break off a piece of that tendril, it actually regrows a whole new plant. So it is a pretty aggressive aquatic plant species because it has the ability to asexually reproduce like that. And some of these species are actually invasive when they're introduced into other areas. Again, this is cool. This is an omnivorous bladderwort eating some algae. And now we're moving on to the Drosera, the sundews. And the word Drosera means dewy, which is a fitting genus for this plant because they are indeed very dewy. This is the most diverse genus worldwide of carnivorous plants. It occurs on almost every single continent except for the frozen ones, basically. And there are over 200 species worldwide. This is the smallest of our Drosera species. You can see my fingertip here in this photo. See how tiny this is? This is Drosera brevifolia. Brevifolia translates from Latin into short foliage, and it indeed does have very short foliage. And mature, fully grown Drosera brevifolia only gets about the size of a nickel, not any bigger than that. But it has an unusually large flower for having such a small little plant. And it's an annual species, so it relies completely on exposed sandy wet soils in order to reseed because it only lives for 1 year and then the whole plant dies and reseeds. It could have also been named cunifolia, which means wedge-shaped foliage because it is distinguishable by its wedge-shaped leaf with its thickened petiole. The petiole is the little stem of a leaf, and this species has a thickened petiole that's fairly wide, and it has these little tentacles, the little hairs that are glandular and sticky, all the way down the petiole, as compared to this species, Drosera capillaris, which is our most common species of butterwort. It occurs across the state, and it is much more common than brevifolia. It gets bigger. It has longer, thinner petioles that do not have the tentacles on it. And what else? Oh, it has much smaller flowers. Even though the plant itself gets larger, the plants get probably max size about 3 inches across at the largest I've ever seen this species. But it still has a tiny little flower compared to this larger flower on this teeny tiny plant, which is interesting. And then I wanted to mention this. This is how the Drosera species functions. Again, the word Drosera translates to dewy, and they have these long hair-like structures that are called tentacles, and they have sticky glands which excrete this sweet, sticky nectar, and they glisten in the sun. They attract insects. Sorry, it's not a nectar. It looks like nectar, and that's what attracts insects. And as soon as the insect gets onto the leaves trying to eat the nectar, it begins to get ensnared by the stickiness of the nectar. And once it starts to struggle and move, those tentacles actually do move toward the insect. So it begins to get covered by all of the tentacles nearby. And that movement also triggers the secretion of acids and enzymes that are able to digest the soft matter of the invertebrate right there on the leaf, and then they absorb it, the nutrients, into the leaf. And so that can happen within hours or days. Again, here's pink sundew, Drosera capillaris. Our most common species. There's a dragonfly that got stuck in one. They can catch pretty large insects, and sometimes even small birds can get stuck up in Drosera, and animals, little lizards and stuff. This is the least common sundew species we have in Florida. This is Drosera intermedia, commonly known as spoonleaf sundew. It is only in the western, central to western panhandle of Florida. In Florida, it's only in the western panhandle, but it has a very large range that goes all the way up the East Coast and into Canada. So it has an extremely large range. It's always interesting to me when plants are adapted to such a large range. It's a very long-lived perennial. The Drosera capillaris is a fairly short-lived perennial. And again, brevifolia is an annual. This is a longer-lived perennial, and this looks very similar to Drosera capillaris, but as you can see, it's got a much more open habit with really long petioles, the long stems on its leaves, and it's the only species of Drosera that is caulescent, which means it forms a stem. Most of our species grow, this is the pink sundew on the left, or on the right, and you can see it doesn't have a stem. It grows basally. The leaves are arranged flat against the ground. And then here on the left, and over here, you have the spoonleaf sundew Drosera intermedia, and you can see how it forms a stem. So it kind of reaches up above the soil, and it has more of an airy, open habit. And this photo, you have both species, capillaris and intermedia, right next to each other. So capillaris is acaulescent, which means no stem, and caulescent means having a stem. And here's our largest species of sundew, Drosera tracei. This is the biggest species of sundew in North America. It's very large. It gets about 12 to 16 inches tall. It has these long, thick, narrow, linear needle-like leaves that are erect and upright. And I took this photo when I was camping in the Western Panhandle near one of the pitcher plant savannas, and I woke up in the early morning, and the morning light was just catching all of the dew and the flowers, and they were all lit up, and they're just so beautiful. And if you drive, down some of our highways, especially in spring, when these plants are up in early morning, you can see them all. They actually catch a lot of actual dew in the morning light, so they're extra shiny in the morning. Here's an insect getting caught in one. This is one of the species that I fairly often see butterflies actually caught in, because the butterflies will be, popping around visiting plants. And because these are so tall, they can catch some of the larger species of insects. And the flowers are really big, very pretty, and they begin to unfurl. Interestingly, they start blooming on the lower part of the stem, and the stems are kind of curled over as they begin to bloom, and the flowers only open for one day, and then the next day this bloom will move up, and the next it will continually unfurl until each flower has bloomed on the stem. And then here's a very interesting species. This is Florida threadleaf sundew, Drosera filiformis, variety Floridana. This is endemic to just 2 counties in Florida, sorry. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. And I suspect, so Drosera filiformis is a species that has a very large native range, but it doesn't occur like south of North Georgia, I think. There's a large disjunction between actual Drosera filiformis straight varieties that go all the way up into Canada, and then down here, in a large distance from the other populations, we have what is currently being called a variety. But I don't think anybody's done any genetic work on this species, and I think that this species will eventually be named as a distinct species that is endemic to Florida, and it will probably be called Drosera floridana. That's my prediction, because I think I've seen Drosera filiformis, and they are very different. This species also, it has a few differences, one of which being that the plant is red. Drosera filiformis populations that occur further north are all green, and they're slightly taller, they have thicker leaves, and this species has a very specific habitat. It only occurs in these sandy margins of a few inland sinkhole lakes, freshwater sinkhole lakes in the central Florida panhandle, and they don't grow anywhere else. They just grow on the edges of a few of these lakes, and most of those lakes got destroyed, and there's really only like a couple of populations of this left. And it probably is going to be named a new species. Okay, now we're moving on to the Linta burlariaceae family, including the Pinguicula, the butterworts. We have 6 species of Pinguicula to Florida, native to Florida. That's more than anywhere else. And the name Pinguicula translates to little greasy one. And if you've ever touched the leaves of Pinguicula, you know they're kind of greasy. And the common name butterwort actually comes from the fact that supposedly people used to make cheese using the leaves of this plant, because they would use it to churn milk with, and the enzymes and bacteria, or the enzymes that actually absorb and break down the insects on the leaves, also help to create butter, apparently, if you churn milk with it. So that's apparently where the common name butterwort comes from. And this species is a Florida endemic. This is Pinguicula planifolia, Chapman's butterwort, or panhandle butterwort. It's probably it's hard to choose favorites, but it's one of my favorite species because it is so showy. It has these really unusual, beautiful, purpley to burgundy to pink to green leaves. They are super variable in their colors. And then the flowers are very large. They can get, almost 2 inches across. Yeah, about 2 inches across, some of the larger ones. And they vary a lot in color. They can be pure white with a yellow throat. They can be deep purple or bright pink. They're just incredibly variable. I mean, isn't that just a stunning species? That is so beautiful. And they occur in areas that are seasonally inundated. So they occur in these low-lying kind of wet, ephemeral wetlands, essentially. Typically, they have muddy, a very silty, muddy bottoms, and they have kind of an overstory of hypericum species kind of growing among them. And then these plants occur all along these shrubby, below these shrubby hypericums. And this little structure on Pinguicula is called a palate, and it looks like a tongue, which is the name palate comes from, right? And it is supposed to, it looks like it's inviting pollen, like it has pollen, but it's a deception. It's just kind of trying to entice insects to come to it, and then if they are able to get nectar out of there, then they're able to fertilize the flower. It has a really interesting, weird stigma too, if you want to look into that, if you're interested. Here are the beautiful leaves, which always remind me of tongues because, I mean, look at that. Doesn't that look like a giant tongue, right? With like the, all of the little spots on it. And again, there are some leaf variation colors, really beautiful. I love the bright pink ones. And they occur in those wet areas, so they are often, the leaves are typically covered in water, and they're actually able to still catch, trap, and digest insects when they're underwater. Super cool. More cool variation in the leaves. And then this is Clearwater butterwort. This is one of our less common species. It only occurs in the Western Panhandle, but where you do find it, you find a lot of individuals. And that's because it's our only species that reproduces asexually. So it creates these little colonies. It sends out these little kind of pups, little babies sprouting from the original plants. And so it produces these dense clusters, and you'll see these beautiful in spring when they bloom. It's really lovely, and especially because each cluster will have its own color, slightly different color, because again, if they're in a clump like this, they're all one genetic individual with the same color, whereas different individuals have different colors. The species name Primula flora translates to primrose-like flowers, and if you grew primroses, if you ever lived further north, then you know this looks a lot like a primrose flower. There are some photos, and it's commonly called Clearwater butterwort because it grows along these beautiful freshwater spring-fed streams in the Western Panhandle, which are so much fun to just spend the day walking through and enjoying all the butterworts and other carnivorous plants. Oh, I think I might have a video of that. Yes. I've took this video in the Western Panhandle, and this is a nice, and then now we are moving on to Pinguicula cerula, which might be my favorite also, because look at that, the veination in those leaves. And then again, the color variation between individuals. This is Pinguicula cerulea, blue butterwort. This species goes fairly far south, so it's got a fairly large distribution across Florida. It has large flowers that are variable in color, but typically have these darker veins against a whiter background. And it has a beautiful white palate, that little tongue-like structure that entices the insects to come into the throat. Oh, such a beautiful species. And they have the chartreuse leaves that most butterworts have, which are that kind of bright lime green color. This species occurs in slightly drier areas. So the species we've seen so far occur in areas that are commonly inundated and underwater. This species is more dry, but still wet soils, but it's not going to get inundated typically. Some nice populations. There are some nice populations of this in St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. And then yellow butterwort, Pinguicula lutea, closely related to this species. They have a very similar distribution and native range. And the flower structure and the leaves are pretty much the same, but they're a different color flower. And this species also occurs slightly higher than the cerulean does. So this one is even slightly drier as far as its habitats, but it occurs in flatwoods with, kind of damp soil in the ecotone just above the wet areas. And it has a very large native range, as I mentioned before. This species is prolific. It's probably one of the more common ones that you see. It's probably the most commonly identified pinguicula species because it has a really large flower and the stalks are tall, so it gets high up above the grasses that it often occurs around. And so people often notice it. But this species probably has the largest range and the largest amount of distribution, but it's less noticeable because it's so tiny. And this is Pinguicula pumila, pumila meaning small. And it is indeed very small. You can see my finger here in this photo. Look at how tiny that flower is. It's a very tiny little plant. Again, they probably only get about the same size as the Drosera brevifolia, only about like the size of a nickel, really. And this species is the southernmost species. So this reaches all the way down to the Florida Keys. And that's the southernmost that we have in the US. There are species that occur in South America. This is I might have said that planifolia was endemic, but I don't think it's totally endemic. This is our only true endemic Florida butterwort. Pinguicula ionantha. It only occurs in a few counties in this area of the Panhandle. And it likes the wet areas. It typically co-occurs with Pinguicula planifolia, the Panhandle butterwort. It's got bright leaves that have a kind of distinctive rounded tip, whereas most of the other species come to kind of a point at the tip. This one, it usually is more rounded. It also has kind of a clearer, I don't know how to explain it, slightly more green, clear green hue to the leaves rather than just that yellowy hue. It's usually white with a deep violet throat, but it also has variation in the color as well. Such a beautiful species. My friend was doing research on this species and she sent me a photo of the Pinguicula ionantha seeds germinating. They're teeny tiny little seeds. Okay, now we're moving on to Sarracenia, the pitcher plants. And so what we call the pitcher of pitcher plants are modified leaves. They are not flowers. A lot of people confuse them for flowers. The flowers, as you see on the left side, that bright, big red thing, that's a flower. They have pendulous flowers with 5 petals and an interesting modified stigma that is shaped like a cup in between the petals. You can see actually a close-up of the modified stigma here and the ovary above it. And there are 3 types of pitcher plant traps. So we have, again, 7 species. They have 3 different types of traps. The most common one we have is this. Oh, did this stop working? Oh, this died. I can progress it manually, but we have the large upright traps, which have this soupy mix of enzymes and acids at the base of it and a little bit of water, but they do not really collect rainwater. They might get a little bit of rainwater, but they have this hood, this lid up at the top that prevents rainwater from coming into the trap, so it doesn't really collect a lot of water. And the insects, they are attracted by nectar around the lip of the entrance of the opening of the pitcher on all species. And then once they go in to this species, all species have these downward facing, very stiff and sharp hairs on the interior of the tubes. And those hairs make it impossible for insects, once they slide in, to climb back out. And the surface of the interior part of The trap is also very waxy and slippery. So it's waxy, slippery, and then there are all these stiff hairs that are preventing them from getting out. With the decumbent pitchers, like Sarracenia rosea, the rose pitcher plant, you can see this big pool of water, and they're open, so they actually collect rainwater. And so they don't have a high concentration of enzymes or acids. They rely on insects falling in there and then drowning. And then it's actually a weak bacteria that is in the water that slowly degrades and digests the insects that fall in there. And because it's not a totally inhospitable environment like the other traps are, this species, Sarracenia rosea, has a whole microcosm of life that occurs in these pitchers. And there are actually species of mosquitoes that are obligates to Sarracenia, and the larvae only live and grow in the Sarracenia pitchers. And then we have the Sarracenia psittacina, the parrot pitcher plant, this one that actually lays flat on the ground. And that type of trap uses these fenestrations, which are light windows. And they're basically white spots that let light come through the pitcher. And you see these sail-like appendages on the plant. They call them a wing. They're also commonly known as an ala, A-L-A. And it's this wing-like appendage that has nectar across the edge of it. And this decumbent prostrate species, it is relying on little insects like little ants and spiders and other little things crawling in the soil that have to crawl over it. And when they are crawling over it, they taste and notice the nectar on that little wing-like appendage, and then they follow that down to the entrance of the hood, the pitcher hood, and then they see those light windows and they think they can exit down there. So then they go down into the trap, and then once they go and keep going, they get stuck down there with all of the stiff hairs, and then that movement triggers the enzymes to be released in that species. So here is that species. This is the species that is prostrate, which meaning it lies flat on the ground. It's not upright. This is parrot pitcher plant, Sarracenia psittacina. And it's commonly known as parrot pitcher plant because it's the heads of those pitchers are supposed to remind you of a parrot, apparently. But you can see they have these beautiful, deep burgundy red flowers. They also have some variation in the flowers as well as in the leaves, according to, they can have slightly mixed genetics, but really beautiful species. The flowers are, probably about 10 to 12 inches tall, the stalks, and they are well above the traps. Most of these plants keep their flowers well above their leaves that eat insects because they don't want to eat their pollinating insects, right? They don't want to kill the species that are pollinating them. And often they're being pollinated, this species are pretty much only pollinated by large bees like carpenter bees, and so those are unlikely to end up in a trap anyways. Here are some more beautiful photos of Sarracenia psittacina, parrot pitcher plant. You can see how the pitchers are kind of floating in the water. You also see how this colony right here is very green, has very little red. The red is a chemical, an antioxidant called anthocyanin, and it is a protective chemical that when the plant is stressed, if it's in too much sun or if it's exposed to a lot of cold weather, it produces more anthocyanins and turns a deeper red color. But if it's in too much shade, it produces almost no anthocyanins, and this is for all Sarracenia species. They produce almost none of that red when they're in too much shade, and their leaves become larger and more voluminous in order to, photosynthesize because they aren't getting enough light. This species, once I was out in Ansbach, Ann's here today, and we had this really strong sudden downpour, and the whole bog was flooded, and there were these beautiful ghostly Sarracenia psittacina underwater, and they were kind of erect because they had trapped air in their little hoods, and the hoods were floating up. Super cool to see. That was a really fun day. And then we have the rose pitcher plant, Sarracenia rosea. This species was for a long time lumped in with Sarracenia purpurea, which is a more northern species that occurs in North Georgia, all the way up into Canada. But then there was this large disjunction, and people thought, oh, there's just this big disjunction of habitat, of range between these two populations. But in the 90s, Rob Nazi, who used to work for FNA here and is now the curator of the New York Botanical Garden, or New York Botanical Garden Herbarium, he noticed that this species was actually distinct from Sarracenia purpurea and described it as a distinct species, Sarracenia rosea. And it is definitely distinct. The main thing being that the flowers are much shorter than Sarracenia purpurea, and they're a rose, more pinky color rather than that deep scarlet red. This species, again, it's the kind that actually catches rainwater, and so it drowns its prey and then digests them with just weak bacteria in the water, and it has all sorts of different insects that live, a little kind of aquatic invertebrates that will live in those pools of water, including an obligate mosquito species. Here are a few photos of variation. You can see the center photo is a population that was in an area that was fire suppressed, and so the canopy was closing up. They were not getting enough sun, and so they turned completely green to try to photosynthesize as much as possible. And then here on the left, this was in the Apalachicola National Forest, and this was in winter, or we had a cold snap and an early spring probably, and so that plant was completely dark purple because of the response to the cold. So again, it was producing all of these antioxidants, the anthocyanins, as a response to cold. And I took this photo on the right as a prescribed fire was moving towards this population, and this species in particular, but all of our Sarracenia species, these are fire-adapted species. So they are practically fire dependent because their habitat, they require a quality habitat that requires fire. And if the fires aren't regularly returning to the habitat that these species are found in, then too many woody plants like Cyrilla and Cliftonia and trees end up coming up around them, eventually shading them out, and then they slowly decline and die. And so if they aren't burned, then they usually end up petering out. And so they don't require fire in order to survive, but fire is required in order to keep their habitat up to their standards, right? And they can burn. I've seen Sarracenia be burned in early spring, and then within a week and a half to 2 weeks, they're up and flowering above the burnt, crispy foliage. They're super fast. They're able to protect their little flowering buds down at the base. This is our southernmost occurring pitcher plant species in the world. So it occurs all the way down to Okeechobee County in Florida, and that is the southernmost point of any Sarracenia to naturally occur, because they only occur in North America, and we are at their southern extent. This is our species with the widest range in Florida, Sarracenia minor. It occurs across Florida and down into the peninsula, again into Okeechobee County. And it is very charismatic. I think pitcher plants in general are charismatic and easy to anthropomorphize because they have these mouth-like structures. But this species in particular, to me, just seems especially expressive, I should say. I love this photo of the one like bent back because it looks like somebody leaning back and laughing really loud. And then sometimes they look kind of evil, like on the right here. They have those fenestrations, the light windows, to attract and fool the insects into thinking that they can exit that way and end up going into the pitcher. This guy on the right reminds me of like a goth dude in middle school with a devil log. Sorry. I think they're so much fun to anthropomorphize. I've have a friend who's a cartoonist, like her illustrator, and I've been talking with her about like doing a series of like cartoons basically with these because they are so fun. And here we are with the king of the Apalachicola National Forest pitcher plant savannas. This is this yellow pitcher plant, Sarracenia flava. And this is often recognized as variety Rugelii, and that form, which is a color form and not truly a variety, which I'll go over more later, is noticeable from other types of Sarracenia flava varieties because they have that red throat, and a very large hood, the lid that goes over the entrance. And that red throat often gives it the common name cutthroat pitcher plant. Some people call it because of that red blotch. They have really beautiful chartreuse, lime yellow kind of flowers and stalks, and they bloom in early spring. They produce their largest pitchers in spring, like most Sarracenia do. And this is the largest of all of our Sarracenia species, with some individuals reaching about 4 feet tall. The first time I ever saw this species, or any carnivorous plant really, was going into the Apalachicola National Forest as an adult, because nobody told me there were all of these cool plants out here until I was an adult, you know? I was so pissed about that. I grew up here and I had no idea that this was here. But the first day I went out to see them, someone gave me this real obscure back road in the middle of ANF. This is probably like 2008 or something. And I was afraid to go out there by myself. So I brought my friend Bonnie, and we went past so many pitcher plants probably to get to this one little population, but we didn't notice the ones on the side of the road, right? And we went down this dirt road. And then as we come out to this field of Sarracenia flava, there was a male peacock came out and then fanned its feathers up. And there was just randomly a peacock out there that day. And then it was just the most memorable day. And I actually wrote an article about it for the Democrat a few years ago. And it was wild because that was a large population and they were up to my chest. Those pictures were so tall and they're so foreign looking and so surreal. The colors are so incredibly bright. It's just a completely surreal experience to get to see these in situ. And we're so lucky to be able to live so close to populations like this. And this is their last stronghold. This is the last place where these plants are surviving. These areas are irreplaceable. And if we don't manage them correctly, and if we don't protect them, these plants will be lost. See how big they get? That is enormous. So Rugelii, this form of Sarracenia flava, is known for being the largest of this species, and it gets really big. That's in the Western Panhandle. And you can see, compared to my hands and compared to my head there, how big they get. Really beautiful. Those are the new fresh pitchers in spring, right after the flowers have, usually the flower stalk comes up before the pitchers do. And this, I can tell just looking at this species, or at this picture, that this population burned probably about a month previous, and the flowers came up right after the burn. And then once the flowers were beginning to fade, the pitchers come up really fast and start opening. Here's a little video of walking. This is one of those little ephemeral wetlands that the Pinguicula planifolia also grows in and occurs in. And then there are these little islands of Sarracenia flava. And the little woody plants that you see all around them are Hypericum species, probably Hypericum. Oh, I always get them either, I can't remember, I'm not even gonna guess. So anyhow, that's a cool little Okay, so infraspecies of Sarracenia flava. So most taxonomists, again, this is a highly collected species, entire genus of plants. Sarracenia are just incredibly charismatic, and they also hybridize readily, and they're just enthralling plants because of the carnivory aspect, and people collect them all over the world. They're worth a lot of money because of that. And because it's basically a marketing tactic, many collectors have named different color forms of the species as varieties, and they started being colloquially called varieties. But at this point, most taxonomists agree that they're not true varieties because they don't, if you saved seed from one of these color forms and planted that seed, you would get a mixture of many different color forms. So because they don't come true from seed reliably, they're considered color forms and not worth varietal rank. So that's a taxonomic rank variety. But there are color forms that it's useful to give them names in order to refer to what the color forms are. And here are some of them. And here are some examples of them. We have Sarracenia flava variety ornata with the red stripes, the pinstripes. We have Sarracenia flava variety atropurpurea, which I think means red body. No, red. What does atro mean? Anybody? Botanists? I can't remember. Anyhow, rubricorpora means red-bodied, so that we know. But purpurea means like purpley form, probably. Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember. Anyhow, it's good to know Latin. I still regret my dad tried to get me to take Latin in high school, and I refused because I was like, when am I ever going to use Latin? And I use it every single day. So he was right. Here's a pitcher plant bog in the Apalachicola National Forest that had been burned a couple months prior in the growing season, so it was well-timed burned, and it resulted in this absolute magical experience. It was so beautiful. You can see all of the Coreopsis nudata, the pink Coreopsis, intermixed with all of the Sarracenia flava. That would be variety rubricorpora. Oops, there it is again. Okay, yeah, darker blackish purple. There you go. Beautiful. So you can see this is an area that is open, very essentially no trees in that open savanna. And if it weren't burned for too long, it would become covered in woody plants that would shade out all of these plants. All right, this is probably what is considered the most showy and probably heavily collected species of Sarracenia in existence. This is Sarracenia leucophylla, which means white leaves. Leuco means white and phylla means leaves. And this species is known for the white windows, the fenestrations on its pitchers, and it often has this veination of either green or burgundy or kind of reddish, depending on color variation, and it has very bright scarlet, tall flowers. The flowers bloom early in spring, probably like March, April, and then the pitchers come up after the flowers. Here are some variations, which this one in the center could be a hybrid because, again, I'll go over that more specifically, but they hybridize readily between species. And this could be a hybrid of the red form of Sarracenia flava with Sarracenia leucophylla, but that's a beautiful color form that you see. You can see why people come from all over the world to see these plants and, unfortunately, to poach these plants, because these hybrids are occurring nowhere else in the world, because there's nowhere else in the world that has 7 species of Sarracenia all growing together and forming these naturally occurring hybrids. And while these plants may seem regionally abundant, you go and you see what are seemingly thousands of plants, and you think, oh, it wouldn't be that big of a deal to take one, right? Well, it is. It is a big deal, unfortunately, because everybody thinks that. And people come from all over the world thinking that. And people come from all over the world digging these plants. I've had so many experiences where I revisit the same sites at many different times of year for many, many years, and I become familiar with individual plants over many years. These plants are extremely long-lived. They form through underground rhizomes, and so they're colonial patches that have probably been there for, could be hundreds of years, if not longer, right? We have no idea, no way to age them. And then to come back 1 year and see where a plant that I'm so familiar with, and I'm expecting to see those specific colors of flowers on this one hybrid at this one spot, and to find a hole in the ground is so heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking. And every time we pick and choose and take plants out of that population, we are becoming part of their selective pressures. And they're not good selective pressures, right? Because we're selecting for just physical characteristics. So here are a couple of flowers, one flower and a couple of pictures, just some color variations. And I wanted to point out, you can see in the white pictures, before the picture actually opens, they're closed at the top. The mouth is closed, you can see right there. And they're filled with air. They have air on the insides before they open. It's really interesting. I assume it's just oxygen. Some flowers on the edge of a bank. More beautiful Leucophylla. And then this species is endemic to Florida, and Dawn won this one in the raffle tonight. This is Sarracenia rubra, subspecies gulfensis, endemic to just the Florida Panhandle. And this population in particular is incredibly beautiful in the Western Panhandle. This species often occurs along those beautiful, fresh, clean, spring-fed creeks out there. And there are a few actual springs that it grows on. And because the springs are not fast flowing, they're not actually really flowing, they're kind of like overflow. The vegetation has formed these mats of Sarracenia rubra that are just floating, these floating mats. And there is also Utricularia and Giraspora intermedia and Juncus repens, all sitting there in these floating mats on the edge of this beautiful sinkhole. And it is so cool to get to swim and then look at all of the plants. I had two botanist friends over here from Ohio once, and I made them swim to come to see these populations. And I was like, you can put your cell phones in my dry bag. And we all put our cell phones in my dry bag, and it was an old dry bag, and it failed and got everybody's cell phone wet. But we were all so excited. We didn't really care. And the cell phones survived, and we all got videos of the cool plants. So here is Sarracenia rubra, subspecies gulfensis. Again, it's got these beautiful pinstripes that are kind of a dark burgundy color on this darker chartreuse green. And then we have Wary's pitcher plant, which is the least common pitcher plant in Florida. There are only a few populations in the most western county in Florida. I can't even remember the name of that county right now, but yeah, Escambia, okay. Since Escambia, maybe Santa Rosa as well, but this is Sarracenia albumensis, subspecies waryi. It looks incredibly similar to this species, which also occurs in the same area, but the tubes are slightly shorter, they're slightly wider, and there's a slightly different lip, basically, but it is virtually indistinguishable. And now we have all of the naturally occurring hybrids, which make this incredibly charismatic genus Aurora even more charismatic, because all of these weirdos just naturally occur in nature. And this is one that you commonly see. This is Sarracenia X formosa. The X denotes hybridization. And the name of the hybrid, some of the more commonly occurring hybrids are given names. And so Sarracenia X formosa is the naturally occurring hybrid of Sarracenia minor, the dwarf pitcher plant, and Sarracenia psittacina, the parrot pitcher plant. And so minor has upright pitchers, and psittacina has those decumbent prostrate pitchers. And so the pitchers on this hybrid are kind of in between, like this. And you see all these weird, and then the flowers, minor has bright yellow flowers, and psittacina has deep scarlet flowers, and you end up with this in-between kind of salmony color flowers. And then here's Sarracenia morii, which is Sarracenia flava X with Sarracenia leucophylla, so the white top pitcher plant and the yellow pitcher plant. And yellow pitcher plant has the yellow flowers again, and the leucophylla has the scarlet flowers, and so you get these weird hybrids with weird flowers. There was one beautiful individual that had this beautiful deep salmon color flower. It was a naturally occurring hybrid of leuco and flava that occurred at the Hosford Bog, and somebody poached it a few years ago, unfortunately. But this is cool to see, the white fenestration windows and a mix with the yellow pitcher plant, dark scarlet throat. So you can see on the left in the photo is a straight leucophylla, and just to the right of it is the hybrid of the two. Some more Sarracenia morii hybrids. And then we have Sarracenia knoxii, which is Sarracenia flava crossed with Sarracenia rosea, which the rosea has those short, fat ones that hold water. And the flava is the tall, upright ones, but they bloom at the same time. And so they hybridize. The pollen gets transferred. And then you end up with these weird, upright, fat, fat individuals. And this was, again, named after Rob Nazi, who first recognized Sarracenia rosea as a distinct species. And I forgot to mention one cool fact about this species. This is the only species of Sarracenia that has a second wave of leaves, of pitchers that come up and fall. And it sends up its pitchers after its flowers in early spring, but then it has a second wave of pitchers that it sends up in fall. And so when people first hypothesized, why is this plant white? Why does it have all these light windows? One of the theories is that it is actually has been selected to catch nocturnal or crepuscular insects, so insects that are more active at nighttime, and that makes them more visible at night, being white. And so another reason people hypothesize that it puts up this second flush of really extra large pitchers. So the second flush of pitchers that come up in fall are larger than the spring pitchers. And one of the reasons that's been hypothesized is that it is coinciding with a harvest moon, which is the largest full moon in our year. And on full moons, they've already proven through studies that this species catches more insects on full moons, on the nights of full moons. And so that's likely why it actually sends up those second wave of pitchers right before it goes dormant, is because it's eating its last big meal on the harvest moon. Oh, okay. So here we are with Sarracenia knoxii again. Really cool one on the right there. Beautiful, weird hybrids. And the other thing too is that these hybrids are fertile. And so the hybrids can then cross. And then they create, there are 7 species potentially of Sarracenia occurring in one bog. And then they could potentially create all of these hybrid swarms where the hybrids are crossing with other hybrids. And it gets really messy in there. But that's what's so unique about this genus, is it's so ready to hybridize, like orchids are too. So this is Sarracenia micheliana. This is a cross between rosea and leucophylla. So you get these weird, fat, semi-upright pitchers with the white light windows. Okay, those are all the species of Sarracenia, and now we're getting into another cool an insect that actually lives and survives and spends almost all of its time inside a pitcher plant pitcher. This is the Exra moth. There are multiple species of this moth, and they're all obligates to Sarracenia. So the moths are crepuscular. They spend the entire day and night inside the pitcher plant, just sitting in there. And then in the evening and in the morning, they come up and they eat nectar and they mate. And then they go back into the pitcher and they lay their eggs on the interior walls of the pitcher. And then the caterpillars hatch and begin to eat the interior walls. You can see one pitcher, I noticed the feeding, the munching had started on the exterior wall of the pitcher. And so I opened it up and there's that fat little gummy worm of a caterpillar. They look tasty, don't they? Yeah, they're cute, pretty cute. And the moths are really cute too. They've got these fuzzy black heads and white, kind of a yellow, white, and black bodies. All right, so here we are with Dionaea muscipula, the Venus flytrap. Dionaea refers to Dione, the, I believe, Roman goddess of love. Also, the Greek version of that would be Venus, right? Or it might be the other way around. It might be the Roman is a Venus and the Greek is Dionaea. But either way, the goddess of love was, she was born on a clamshell. She emerged from a clamshell from the ocean. And that's where they're referring to Dionaea because it looks like a clamshell, right? And then muscipula actually means mousetrap. So another great name for this plant. And again, this is a monotypic genus, which means there's only one species within the genus. And so there's only muscipula within the genus Dionaea. It's in the Droseraceae family, so it's related to the Drosera. And as I mentioned, it's not native to Florida, but it is naturalized in some areas because it was introduced. It was planted from seed. Some people still plant it. Please do not plant or dig anything from these pitcher plant areas. They should not be messed with, period. They know what they're doing and they need to be, left alone to do that. So this is, there are disagreements about this, but personally, I feel like this species should not be considered invasive. Some people might call it invasive, but I consider it functionally native because it is co-occurring in pretty much the same habitat that it evolved in the green swamps of North Carolina. You can see the original range up here is in the Carolinas. It's it's endangered, federally endangered in that area that it is native to. But it was introduced down here mostly from people who wanted to grow it in order to dig it and sell it, right? But it is sustaining itself in populations and somewhat, I would say, spreading very slowly. But because it is living within the same system of co-associate species, that it's still living with the same system of natural checks and balances that it evolved with in the Carolinas. So it's never going to become an aggressive invasive that will outcompete our native species. But there are, varying opinions on that, and you will get them. But I would personally never say it's okay to dig one of these, even though they're not native, because I don't think anybody should start digging in any of these areas because it's just a line I don't think should be crossed, unless you're doing research or something. And when you do dig something up, you're removing soil, you're digging other things up as well. Again, you also shouldn't be planting anything. I know a lot of people sometimes think, oh, I'm helping a plant if I bring seeds from North Carolina of this Sarracenia and plant it down here, but please don't introduce plants like that to natural areas. Anytime you introduce a plant, you're introducing other things like bacteria and fungi and potential pests and pathogens. So you also shouldn't do that as well. Oh, one thing I had to point out is, see this teeny tiny little baby Dionea, the baby Venus flytrap? You can see my finger there. One of the cool things about carnivorous plants is that their form is integral to their functioning, right? They need to have those traps in order to eat. And so most plants, when they're young little babies, they don't look like their adult, fully mature versions. Like a young sycamore is going to look very different than a mature sycamore, or a young baby Liatris is going to look very different from more mature Liatris. But because both Sarracenia and Drosera and Dionea, they all need, their form is essential to their ability to get nutrients. When they're babies, they look like miniature versions of themselves. So you'll find teeny tiny little Sarracenia that are just teeny tiny little miniature versions of a Sarracenia, and that's so cool. And what nobody has done, as far as I know, is done the research to figure out how the species what species they're feeding on change as they get larger and larger, because they are, just by their size alone, relegated to catching much smaller little invertebrates when they're really tiny. And that would be a really cool study to do. So here are some videos of the traps that's me poking around in there. There are 3 hairs on either side of that clamshell trap. And at least 2 of those hairs have to be triggered. You can see the variation between those individuals. Look at how green that one is. And that's a really big trap. But there's a lot of just natural variation in between them. I'm talking about things in this video, but you can't really hear. But the function of the trap is really interesting. So it closes. It has those 3 hairs. 2 of those hairs have to be triggered in order for it to close. And what triggers it to close, when those hairs are triggered, there are these cells on the exterior of the walls. And when they're triggered, an electrical impulse kind of stimulates those cells, forces them to grow, to expand, and the exterior expansion of the walls forces the trap closed, essentially. It's like basically hydraulics. And it closes just partially at first. And it does that because it doesn't want to expend its energy putting out a bunch of enzymes if the insect is too small. And so it closes partially, and that allows the smaller insects to leave. And then it will just reset itself if that's the case. But if it's a large enough insect that it gets trapped when it's only partially closed, then the hairs get triggered again because that insect is moving around. And then it closes all the way, and it actually seals up. And then as the insect continues to move, it triggers the exuding acids and enzymes, and then it actually digests that plant really quickly, or insect really quickly, within hours to days, and then the trap is actually able to reset itself. It can only do that a few times, but it can do that multiple times. And one of the interesting things is that after it resets itself, it still has some of those exoskeletons hanging out, which create more bait for insects to come, because one of the insects that it most commonly traps and eats is spiders. And the spiders are probably attracted to those exoskeletons, or to insects that are also attracted to the traps. Okay, so here is what poaching looks like. It often is visible for several months after it happens. And again, these plants are highly sought after by people worldwide, and they're highly collected and sold for a lot of money online. And so please never dig these plants in the wild. Be very careful about who you share locations with. I don't share these locations with some of my best friends. I'm very protective of these spots, and that's something that I've become over time because I've seen the detrimental effects of over-visitation and of poaching. And so these areas, these savannas, they are very wet soils and they're very prone to soil compaction. And with too much visitation, too much feet in these wet soils, it compacts them and it becomes almost irreversible because those paths, over time, even decades later, they still don't regrow the same species. They're still compacted. And again, these plants, they might look really plentiful in the national forest, but you have to remember that this is the last place where they occur. What we have now, in Florida, we have the most amount of species of carnivorous plants, and we have the most amount of individuals as far as number of individual carnivorous plants. But we have less than 3% of what used to be here. We have a teeny tiny sliver of what we used to have. And so what we have remaining is extremely precious. There's nowhere else on Earth where they exist. And we have to understand how precious they are, how sensitive these habitats are, and how much they deserve our protection, our respect, and we have to manage them as well. So one of the issues that we're facing is fire suppression. That's one of the biggest causes of the decline of carnivorous plant species. Fire suppression, which again creates them eventually getting shaded out by woody plants. And then on top of that, there's development, which is probably the largest issue with the existential, problems of carnivorous plant species is development. And that includes changes in hydrology due to development. And then the poaching is actually a large component of the decline of carnivorous plant species as well. And so if you want to grow these plants, you, one, have to be ready to kill a lot of them because they are hard to grow. I've tried growing many of them, and if you are not dedicated to it, to providing their exact necessities, and they can be really finicky, then they're going to die. And that's just the way it is. They're very particular. They need full sun, and they need a specific amount of moisture consistently. They need a lot of specific soil requirements, etc. And you cannot grow them inside unless you have a whole setup for them. And if you are purchasing them, buy from large, reputable growers. Native Nurseries sells plants that are grown from seed by Pearson Hill. He responsibly collects the seed, and then he grows them from seed. That's great. If you find the plants on Facebook Marketplace, on Craigslist, on eBay, on some guy on the side of the road, those plants are poached from the wild, and that is incredibly harmful to the continuation of these species. A lot of these species and a lot of carnivorous species from other areas of the world are in areas that are more poor than this area, and they are being poached to extinction. The Nepenthes in the wild are being poached to extinction, and the people who are buying them are plant lovers. They're people like you who love plants and love them so much, but the only way they know how to show their love and appreciation for them is through ownership. And I would implore everyone to begin to expand what your idea of love and appreciation is of a species. Appreciating a species is appreciating the role that it plays in its ecosystem. That is the coolest thing about these plants, are the role or what they provide in their habitat and the roles and interactions that they have within them. And we should respect them and let them be where they are, right? And you can enjoy them from the side of the road or from the paths in the national forests, but be careful and considerate when you're visiting them. And please be very careful about sharing locations. Don't share them online publicly. And be very careful about who you share them to and make sure those people know the ramifications of removing plants, just one plant, from an ecosystem. And again, our public lands, these plants occur mostly on public lands. Our public lands are under threat, and the management of our public lands are also under threat. So doing what you can to advocate for the protection and management of our public lands is really important also for the survival of carnivorous plant species. And and here's my slide that I was supposed to show to go over all of this. So again, yeah, Florida has the most species of carnivorous plants in the US and the largest populations of individual plants, but we have less than 3% of what was once here, and we continue to lose more every single day. So these plants, these areas are precious, they're unique, they're irreplaceable, and we need to do all that we can to protect them. Again, threats to carnivorous plants: habitat loss, fire suppression, and poaching. Oh, so what can you do? Oh, I had whole slides set up for this. Sorry, it's been a while since I gave this talk. You advocate for and vote for land conservation and adequate land management, mostly prescribe fire. Do not share locations and visit with respect. Obscure all your iNaturalist observations. Even the common plant species, you should, if you're in natural areas, you should obscure all of those observations, because if you're observing a Sarracenia and then 2 minutes later you take up an observation of a Biden's alba near it, Biden's alba, people will be able to see and figure out exactly where those carnivorous plants are. So I obscure all my iNaturalist observations just to be safe. And again, please purchase responsibly. And that's the end of my talk.